Now, y'all may not know this. This may be news to you, but I was born in the South, south of the Mason-Dixon line. I know that may come as a shock to some of y'all, but it's true. Anyway, since that ridiculous rally in Charlottesville, a town I know well, and all this business about Confederate statues, Southern attitudes and culture have been in the news. And even though I'd never speak for my Southern brothers and sisters, I really don't care whether they move Confederate monuments from in front of a courthouse to a museum or a battlefield. I really don't care. Now, I'm sorry if that upsets some Yankees whose ancestors fought and died defending the United States against these rebel leaders. I'm sorry if it's a big deal to a lot of folks living in the North. But I, as a Southerner, just don't see Jefferson Davis a pretty ineffective leader when you get right down to it. A guy who would rank somewhere, if he was president of the United States, between Millard Fillmore and Warren G. Harding, as a part of that Southern heritage for which I feel pride. Of course, I'm only speaking for myself. What does kind of irritate me is the phrase, turning south. Have you ever heard that? Turning south. And what it's come to mean. At least it did before I learned the reasons why. Let me explain. According to the website called, and get this, English Language Learners Stack Exchange, which is a question and answer site for speakers of other languages learning English, turning south is an idiomatic expression meaning turning bad. When something turns south, it ain't getting better. Now, that's what it means. And I've got to tell you, I thought that was just plain wrong. In fact, I thought it was awful. Until I read that this saying came from the orientation of maps. That's how we got that little saying. You see, when we're looking at a map, we generally assume that the top is north and the bottom is south, right? If it's there in front of us, top is north, bottom is south. And so if we turn the map so that the north is down, well, that's just plain wrong. One might even say it's bad, at least if we want to understand the map. Therefore, turning south is considered a bad thing. At least that's what it says on the internet, and so we all know it must be true. But regardless of the reason, I think we'd all agree there are times when we feel that our lives are idiomatically turning south. In other words, that bad things are happening to good people, like us. And we suddenly find ourselves overwhelmed by all kinds of problems. Stuff is happening, and we feel like we're drowning. Now, I could stand up here and give you examples of what I'm talking about, but I really don't think that's necessary. I mean, when you're talking about problems and pain, fears, and frustrations, those things are just events that you know when you're facing them. Nobody needs to give you an example. And at one point or another, we all face them, right? We all face this kind of business. And I'm talking about times when bad things just plain happen. And there we are, experiencing all kinds of different emotions, right? I mean, sometimes it makes us angry when this stuff occurs. Because it's just ridiculous that we have to take time out of our schedule, that we have to take the energy and make the effort to deal with a bunch of just plain nonsense. Now, you know what I'm talking about. And sometimes it makes us sad. Because it doesn't matter how you spin it. Stuff comes up that makes us feel sort of like a balloon with the air slowly leaking out. But whether it comes out as anger or sadness, dealing with a southern turn, man, it wears us out, doesn't it? It drains our energy. I'm telling you, it seems to sap both our strength and our will. And without either of those, well, it's doubtful that we can be much good to anybody, not to ourselves or to others. But when we're at that point, we may need to take a look at this passage from Matthew. The one that deals with the conversation Jesus had with his disciples as they were crossing through the region of Caesarea Philippi. And I'll tell you why. I believe both Peter's confession and Jesus' response can really help us endure when we feel as though our lives have turned south. You see, when we feel like our lives have become one big fat problem, I believe this passage reminds us that God has given us two things we might need both to recognize and to claim. For example, first, I think these verses show us that God has given us a special truth. Some insider information that can offer a lot of help when things seem to be falling apart. And like I said, it's right here in this passage. After asking his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And hearing them say, some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, but others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. And after saying, but you, who do you say that I am? And hearing Simon Peter answer and respond with, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, Jesus said something that I think is remarkable. He said, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Now, this is a big deal. Just think about what's happening here. Through his words, Peter nailed Jesus' true identity. In fact, he offered the most profound and complete description of Jesus in the entire Gospel of Matthew. In other words, he acknowledged that this guy, we're talking about this guy, he'd been following all around Galilee, that this guy was in fact the Christ. The one who came with all kinds of power and authority to set his people free. But that he was also the Son of the living God. In other words, the one who brought the presence of God into human space and who would bring humanity with all its warts and flaws right into the very nature of God. Now that's pretty important. But Jesus went even further by saying this awareness wasn't because Peter was all that smart or all that lucky. Instead, it was actually a gift of God. In other words, God himself had given Peter this special truth. And I'll tell you why I think that's important for us to remember. You see, right here and right now, we can also make the same confession Peter made. We can also nail his identity if we choose. We can also acknowledge that through Jesus, God has and continues to show his power and his presence. And I'll tell you, if this is something we believe, something that we trust, something in which we have faith, I don't see how we can feel truly helpless, regardless of the mess we face. And I'll tell you something else. Since this is the same confession Peter offered, I think I'm safe in saying that flesh and blood didn't reveal it to us either. Therefore, in spite of what we might feel at the moment, we are not alone. I'm telling you, when our lives seem to be turning south, I think we need to remember that God has given us a special truth. That's one. And second, I think we also need to remember that God has also given us a special place where we can feel both secure and confident. Just think about what Jesus said to Peter after the confession. He said, and I myself say to you, you are rock. And upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the underworld will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you might bind upon the earth will have been bound in heaven. And whatever you might loose upon the earth will have been loosed in heaven. And he gave the disciples instruction so that they might tell no one that he was the Christ. Of course, our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters see this as a statement giving Peter and his spiritual descendants special authority over the church. Now, that's what they believe, but I really don't want to deal with whether or not that's the best reading of the Greek right now. I mean, that is another sermon or maybe an article. Rather, I want you to think about what Jesus was saying in a broader sense. You know, what he was saying, not just about Peter, but about the whole church. Now, again, just think about the words. For Jesus, this new body, this new community was going to endure. It was going to be stronger than death. As a matter of fact, even if the army of the devil himself were released on the earth, not unlike the kind of stuff you might see in hundreds of horror movies, if that should happen, Satan and all his underworld minions will not be able to crush the church. Now, that's what I call endurance. And this stuff about the kingdom, the keys of the kingdom, and all this business about binding and loosing, based on what Jesus said and Matthew wrote in other passages, I believe both images are connected with teaching. In other words, the church sharing the message it's been given. For example, when he was warning the crowds and his disciples about the teachers of the law, he said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you lock people out of the kingdom of heaven. For you do not go in yourselves, and when others go in, you stop them." You see, in contrast to them who lock folks out, Christians have been given the keys. By what they share, they're opening the kingdom to others. And just listen to how he defined binding and loosing. As Jesus was offering his disciples advice on how to deal with issues that might come up in this new community, the church, the ecclesia, he said, if another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. Man, that's good advice. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take one or two others with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Okay? If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender fails to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly, I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. You see, in these verses, the binding and loosing was grounded on the kind of stuff that was being shared. You see, our message, and I'm talking about that message of divine grace and mercy and love, man, that message has power. It can bind and loose. It offers the key. It has authority. And I'll tell you, along with the ability of the church to endure, that's important to remember. I mean, sometimes problems can make us feel frightened and vulnerable. They can cause us to question and to doubt. They can lead us to worry about the future and question whether we can even survive the present. Sometimes we're ready. I know I am. To just throw up my hands and say, I got to get away. Man, they can just beat us down. But as Jesus said to Peter, God has given us this place, this community that can and will remain until Jesus comes back. Therefore, we can always feel secure. And he's given us this community. He's given us this community that carries a message that has real authority. Therefore, we can always experience confidence. No matter how stressed we feel or discouraged we become, that's not going to change. I'm telling you, when our lives turn south, we can claim this very special place God has given us, and that's too. Now, even though I'm proud to be a Southern boy, I really shouldn't be too bent out of shape by this turning south business, especially if it has to do with the right way to orient maps. I mean, think about it. If you're sitting at a table, and if you're looking at a map that's laid out the way we'd expect, what direction, north here, south here, what direction is closest to the human heart? North? East? West? South, right? Of course, that would also mean we should love Antarctica, but I don't want to go there. But you know, whether or not you buy what I just said, that really doesn't matter. I think we can agree that there are times when we all feel overwhelmed by problems, and those problems can make us angry and sad and tired. That's just the way it is. But I hope we can also agree that when that happens, God has given us two things we might need to claim. He's given us a special truth, one that reminds us that we are never helpless and that we're never alone. And He's given us a special place that can help us feel secure and confident. And that's going to be true regardless of the direction our lives turn. Amen.